The Blackwood Mansion stood atop a jagged cliff, like a mourning widow. For decades, it had been a place of whispers and shadows. The townspeople of Raventree avoided the iron gates, claiming the air around the estate tasted of copper and old secrets. This was the fortress of Victor Blackwood, the man once known as the undisputed king of the continental underworld. Now, he was a ghost, a recluse rumored to have lost his mind to the violence of his past. Elara stood before those gates, her small suitcase clutched in a trembling hand. She didn't come for the money. Though the pay was astronomical for a simple maid, she came because she had no other choice. Her brother owed a debt to the very men Victor Blackwood used to command, and this job was her only way to buy his freedom. As the heavy gates creaked open without a soul in sight, she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes watching her from the dark windows. The interior of the mansion was a graveyard of opulence. Dust danced in the slivers of moonlight that managed to penetrate the thick velvet curtains. The air was heavy with the scent of aged mahogany and something metallic like cold steel. There was no welcoming committee, only a set of strict instructions left on a silver tray in the foyer. Rule number 1 was simple but terrifying. Never enter the West Wing after midnight. Elara's footsteps echoed through the hollow halls as she moved toward the kitchen. She began her work immediately, cleaning surfaces that hadn't been touched in years. She felt a presence behind her, a cold draft that made the hair on her neck stand up. Turning slowly, she saw nothing but a flickering candle. She realized then that the mansion wasn't just old. It felt alive, as if the walls themselves were breathing. On the third night, Elara heard the sound for the first time. It was a low, mournful melody played on a piano, coming from the forbidden West Wing. It wasn't the music of a madman. It was a song of profound grief, driven by a curiosity she knew was dangerous. She followed the sound. She climbed the winding staircase, the shadows stretching and twisting around her like reaching fingers. She reached a set of massive oak doors. The music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the melody. Before she could turn back, the door swung open. A man stood there, silhouetted against a fireplace. He was tall, his shoulders broad, wearing a silk robe that looked like liquid midnight. This was Victor Blackwood. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a fallen god. "I gave you a list of rules, Elara," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He didn't look at her, yet she felt his gaze pinning her to the spot. "Do you find it difficult to follow instructions, or do you simply have a death wish?" Elara swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. I heard the music. I thought someone was in pain." Victor finally turned his head. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, a brutal reminder of the world he had left behind. His eyes were not the eyes of a madman, but of a strategist who had seen too much. "Pain is the only thing this house produces," he said, stepping into the light. "Go back to your room. If I find you here again, you will learn why the world believes I am a beast." Elara didn't run. She stood her ground, her eyes meeting his. "The world is usually wrong about things it's afraid of," she said. Victor froze, a flash of genuine surprise crossing his dark features. For a moment, the tension between them was electric, a collision of two lonely souls in a house built on blood. Then, with a flick of his hand, he dismissed her, retreating back into the shadows of the West Wing. The next morning, Elara found a rare black rose on her cleaning trolley. There was no note, but she knew where it came from. As she cleaned the library, she discovered a hidden compartment in a desk. Inside was a ledger filled with names of judges, politicians, and rival mafia lords. She realized then that Victor wasn't hiding because he was crazy. He was hiding because he held the Black Ledger, a document that could set the entire underworld on fire. Suddenly, the front doors of the mansion were kicked open. 3 men in tactical gear, carrying silenced weapons, breached the foyer. They weren't there to talk. They moved with the lethal efficiency of professional hitmen. Elara ducked behind a marbled statue, her heart hammering. She realized the outside world had finally tracked down the ledger. Victor was no longer just a recluse. He was a target, and she was trapped in the crossfire. She heard a gunshot from the floor above, followed by a heavy thud. The hitmen were heading straight for the West Wing. Elara knew she should run for the back exit, but she thought of the man playing the piano in the dark. She thought of the Black Rose. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy brass fire poker and began to climb the servants' stairs, hoping she wasn't too late to save the beast of Blackwood. Elara's lungs burned as she reached the upper landing. The silence of the mansion had been replaced by the rhythmic thud of tactical boots and the sharp, metallic click of weapons being readied. She stayed low, moving through the shadows like the dust she spent her days cleaning. Ahead, she saw two of the hitmen standing outside the oak doors of the West Wing. They were placing a small, high-tech, explosive charge on the lock. Before they could detonate it, a shadow detached itself from the ceiling. Victor didn't use a gun. He moved with a savage, animalistic grace. He dropped onto the first man, his blade finding a gap in the tactical vest with surgical precision. The second man swung his rifle around, but Victor was already moving, using the first man as a shield. The hallway erupted in a muffled burst of gunfire, the bullets shredding the ancient wallpaper. Elara saw a third man sneaking up behind Victor from a side corridor. He was raising a pistol to the back of Victor's head. Without thinking, she stepped out of the shadows and swung the brass fire poker with every ounce of her strength. It connected with the hitman's wrist, the gun skittering across the floor. The man growled, turning toward her, but his eyes widened as Victor's hand clamped onto his throat like a vice. Victor slammed the attacker against the wall, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, cold fury. With a sharp twist, the man went limp. Victor dropped him and turned to Elara. His face was splattered with blood, his breathing heavy. For a moment, the beast was fully visible, and Elara felt a wave of pure, primal fear. But then, Victor reached out and gently took the fire poker from her trembling hands. "I told you to go to your room," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you run?" Elara looked at the carnage in the hallway and then back at him. "The gates were locked," she lied, her voice shaking, "and I didn't think you should fight them alone." Victor let out a dark, dry laugh. He pulled her into the West Wing and slammed the doors, locking them with a heavy iron bolt. The West Wing was different from the rest of the house. It was filled with monitors, maps, and ancient books. In the center of the room sat a massive iron safe. Victor went to a desk and pulled out a hidden compartment, revealing a gold-plated revolver. "They aren't here for me, Elara. They are here for the ledger. It contains the names of the 7 families and their offshore accounts. If that book leaves this house, the world burns." Suddenly, the house shook. A second team had entered from the roof. Dust fell from the ornate ceiling as heavy footsteps thudded above them. Victor grabbed a leather bag and shoved the ledger inside. He turned to a bookshelf and pulled a hidden lever. A section of the wall groaned and slid open, revealing a narrow, stone staircase. "This leads to the sea caves below. You take the bag and go. I'll hold them here." "No," Elara said, grabbing his arm. "I'm not leaving you. You're wounded." She pointed to his shoulder, where a bullet had grazed him during the struggle. Victor looked at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "You are just a maid, Elara. Why do you care if a monster lives or dies?" She stepped closer, the smell of gunpowder and black roses surrounding them. "Because monsters don't play the piano like that." The doors of the West Wing began to buckle under the pressure of a battering ram. Victor realized he couldn't argue. He grabbed her hand, his palm was hot, and Calistan pulled her into the secret passage. They descended into the cold, damp darkness of the cliffside. The stairs were steep and slick with moss. Above them, they heard the doors finally give way, followed by the frustrated shouts of the mercenaries. They reached a hidden grotto where the ocean waves crashed against the jagged rocks. A small, black speedboat was moored to a rusted iron ring. Victor jumped in and pulled Elara down just as a red laser dot appeared on the stone wall behind them. A sniper was positioned on the balcony high above. Victor fired his revolver upward, the muzzle flash illuminating the cave, and then slammed the boat's engine into gear. The boat roared to life, cutting through the dark water. As they cleared the sea cave, the moonlight hit the mansion one last time. From this distance, it looked like a crumbling tooth in a giant's mouth. Elara looked at Victor, who was steering the boat with one hand while clutching his bleeding shoulder with the other. He looked exhausted, the weight of his empire finally catching up to him. "Where are we going?" Elara asked over the roar of the wind. Victor looked toward the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were breaking, "To a place where the 7 families can't find us. A place where I can finally burn that book and you can finally be more than a maid." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. "But first, we have to survive the morning. And they are coming." The speedboat carved a white scar across the black velvet of the ocean. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the Blackwood Mansion was nothing more than a silhouette against the cliffs. Victor steered them toward a small, uninhabited island known as the Ash Point. It was a jagged piece of rock covered in gray sand and twisted trees, holding a small stone cottage that served as Victor's ultimate emergency hideout. Hasta que Victor stumbled. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the wound on his shoulder was beginning to take its toll. Elara caught him, her small frame straining under his weight. She led him into the cottage, which was surprisingly clean and stocked with medical supplies. She pushed him down onto a wooden chair and began to peel away his blood-soaked shirt. The sight of his chest, covered in scars from old battles, made her breath catch in her throat. "Every scar has a name." "Elara," Victor whispered. His eyes closed in pain. "Most of them belong to people who are no longer breathing." Elara didn't flinch. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, her movements confident and steady. "Then, let's make sure this one doesn't get a name," she replied. As she stitched the skin, Victor looked at her, his usual coldness replaced by a strange, quiet wonder. No one had touched him with such gentleness in years. Over the next 3 days, the island became their world. There were no mansions, no ledgers, and no hitmen, just the sound of the waves and the crackle of the fireplace. Elara found herself drawn to the man behind the monster. She learned that Victor had been born into the Mafia, a prince of a dark kingdom he never asked for. He had spent his life trying to keep the violence from spilling into the streets, using the ledger to keep the 7 families in check. "The world thinks I'm a beast because I keep the other beasts in cages," Victor explained one evening. He was sitting by the fire, his hand resting on the leather bag containing the ledger. "If I burn this, I lose my leverage. They will hunt me until I am dead. But if I keep it, I am forever a prisoner of my own power." Elara sat beside him, the glow of the flames reflecting in her eyes. Maybe it's time to stop being a warden and start being a man. The tension between them shifted from fear to a deep, simmering attraction. One night, as the wind howled outside, Victor reached for her hand. His touch was no longer the grip of a killer, but the reach of a man drowning in loneliness. He pulled her closer, his lips hovering inches from hers. "You shouldn't be here, Elara. You should be in the light, far away from a shadow like me." Elara leaned in, closing the gap. "The light is boring, Victor. I've always preferred the stars." Their kiss was desperate and hungry, a collision of 2 people who had spent their lives in different kinds of solitude. In that moment the Mafia King was gone, and the maid was no longer a servant. They were just 2 souls seeking warmth in a cold world. But even in their sanctuary, the shadows were closing in. Victor's satellite phone buzzed, a signal that his encrypted perimeter around the island had been breached. "They found us," Victor said, his voice instantly returning to its cold, commanding tone. He stood up and grabbed a tactical rifle hidden under the floorboards. "The 7 families have united. They sent their cleaners. They don't want the ledger anymore. They want us arrested." He looked at Elara, a flash of regret crossing his face. "I should have sent you away when I had the chance." Elara didn't panic. She had lived in the dark mansion. She had survived the night of the breach. She grabbed a flare gun and a pouch of ammunition. "You're not fighting them alone, Victor. Not this time." She knew the island's terrain better than the invaders. She suggested they use the Ashen Caves on the north side, where the narrow tunnels would force the cleaners to fight one by one. Victor nodded, a grim smile of pride on his face. They moved into the gray woods as the first tactical helicopter appeared in the sky like a giant, buzzing insect. Searchlights swept across the sand, turning the gray dunes into a blinding white. Victor and Elara moved with synchronized precision. Victor provided the cover fire, his rifle echoing through the trees, while Elara set traps using the island's natural hazards. She was no longer just a maid. She was the beast's partner. As they reached the entrance of the caves, a grenade detonated nearby, sending a shower of hot ash over them. Victor shoved Elara inside and turned to face the first wave of cleaners. He was a whirlwind of violence, his movements a blur of lethal efficiency. But there were too many of them. A bullet caught his leg, and he fell to his knees. The lead cleaner stepped forward, raising his weapon for the final blow. Elara didn't hesitate. She fired the flare gun directly at the cleaner's feet, where she had hidden a small canister of gasoline from the boat. The explosion was blinding, creating a wall of fire between them and the invaders. In the chaos, she dragged Victor deep into the tunnels. They reached a dead-end cliff, overlooking the churning sea. There's no way out. Victor gasped, his strength fading. Give them the ledger. Elara, save yourself. Elara looked at the leather bag, then at the man she had come to love. She realized that as long as the ledger existed, they would never be free. She pulled a lighter from her pocket and looked Victor in the eyes. You said you wanted to stop being a warden. With a single flick, she set the ledger on fire. The secrets of the 7 families turned into glowing embers, floating away into the dark ocean air. The ledger burned with a hauntingly beautiful blue flame. The names of the world's most powerful criminals turning into weightless ash. As the last page crumbled and drifted into the ocean, the leverage that had kept Victor a prisoner for a decade vanished. The hitmen, seeing the destruction of the data they were sent to retrieve, hesitated. Their mission was now a failure, and without the ledger, Victor Blackwood was no longer a threat to the 7 families. He was a ghost of a dead era. But the cleaners were not paid for mercy. Even without the ledger, they had orders to leave no witnesses. The lead mercenary, his face scorched from Elara's flare trap, stepped through the thinning wall of fire. He leveled his submachine gun at the 2 figures standing on the edge of the cliff. Victor, barely able to stand, pulled Elara behind him. He had 1 bullet left in his revolver and a heart full of a strange new peace. Before the mercenary could pull the trigger, the sound of a heavy caliber rifle shot rang out from the ocean. The mercenary's chest erupted, and he collapsed into the gray sand. Another shot followed, then another, picking off the remaining cleaners with terrifying precision. Elara and Victor looked out toward the water. A massive, unmarked black frigate was emerging from the fog, its turrets turned toward the island. It wasn't the Mafia, it was Interpol's Black Ops division. Elara's brother, Julian, had not been idle. While Elara was in the mansion, he had used the small bits of information she had sent him to strike a deal with the international authorities. He had traded his knowledge of the Ghost Clan for a rescue mission. The Maid had been a Trojan horse all along, but not the kind Victor expected. She had been the bridge between a man who wanted out and a world that wanted justice. The Interpol team swarmed the island, securing the perimeter and providing medical aid. Victor was handcuffed to a stretcher, but his eyes never left Elara. He didn't look angry. He looked relieved. He knew that by burning the ledger and surrendering, he was choosing a prison of stone over a prison of fear. As they loaded him into the helicopter, he reached out and touched Elara's hand. "You did it," he whispered. "The beast is finally dead." 1 year later, the world had moved on. The 7 families had been decimated by the evidence Interpol gathered from the mansion after the fire. The Blackwood estate was now a historical site, its dark halls filled with tourists instead of shadows. But in a quiet coastal town in the south of France, a small bookstore had recently opened. It was a place of high ceilings, velvet curtains, and the faint, sweet scent of black roses. The owner of the shop, a woman named Elara, was closing up for the evening. She walked to the back of the store, where a man sat at a grand piano, his fingers moving across the keys with a gentle, haunting melody. He was no longer dressed in silk robes or tactical gear, but in a simple linen shirt. His face still bore the jagged scar, but the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady light. Victor looked up as she approached, his hands coming to a rest on the keys. He stood up and pulled her into a soft embrace, the sound of the ocean waves outside matching the rhythm of their breathing. They were no longer a king and a maid, or a beast and a beauty. They were simply 2 people who had survived the dark and found each other in the dawn. The secrets were gone, the debts were paid, and the music was finally their own. Elara smiled, leaning her head against his chest. She thought back to the night she first entered the Blackwood gates, a terrified girl with a suitcase. She realized then that she hadn't just saved his life. He had saved hers by showing her that even in the darkest mansion, love is the only thing that can't be burned away. As the stars began to appear over the Mediterranean, the silent king and his queen walked toward the water, leaving the shadows behind forever.